Welcome to today's webinar. I'm Andrea Shindlebower, Maine, Personal Services Manager with the Kentucky League of Cities, and I will be your presenter. Before we get started with the webinar, I want to go over a few housekeeping items. First, if you have any technical difficulties, such as audio or visual issues, use the chat feature and select Send to All Panelists so our training and administrative associate can assist you. Also, keep in mind that this webinar will be available to you on demand starting later today or tomorrow and will be available through the middle of January. As soon as it is available, we will send it out in an email with the link, as well as the presentation and other helpful materials to all registered participants. So keep in mind, if there are any technical issues that you cannot resolve, you will still have access to the content through mid-January. If you have questions for me regarding the content of this webinar, use the Q&A feature. We have 80 participants registered for today's webinar, so I am likely going to have to hold questions to the end in order to be able to get through all the content within the hour, but I will respond to all questions. Also note there will be random polling questions throughout the webinar, and by answering these polling questions, it will ensure that the registered user receives training credit. Lastly, I want to be certain that you are aware that we have 2 additional webinars on the calendar. The first is on ABC regulatory fees, and it will be live December 16th from 2 to 3. The second is open records and law enforcement, which will be live January 23rd from 2 to 3. And we plan to have various other topics in the months to follow. You can register for any of the upcoming webinars at www.klc.org. And if you have any specific requests for topics, feel free to let us know. For today's topic, I'm going to provide you with information on the changes occurring to the federal overtime laws beginning January 1st, 2020. These changes will likely impact your organization. We will start with a review of Federal Labor Standards Act, also referred to as the FLSA, as well as Kentucky wage and hour laws. We will then look at the changes to the final rule that may impact an employee's exempt status. And I'll provide an overview of the requirements that allows an employee to be exempt from overtime. And lastly, we will also look at the potential challenges facing employers based on the changes and go over 6 steps you can take now to prepare. First, let's review the Fair Labor Standards Act, as well as the Kentucky wage and hour laws. Both of these laws establish minimum wage, overtime pay, record keeping, and child labor standards, as well as requirements for employers to pay employees at least minimum wage and overtime for all time actually worked over 40 hours in a work week, unless the employee falls into an exempt category. All right, we're going to have our first Test Your Knowledge poll. And we're just starting out, so I just want to see what you may already have as knowledge. Our first poll is regarding exempt categories. And the question is, exempt categories include all of the following except professional, administrative, blue-collar workers, executive or supervisory, computer. So pick which one of these categories is not exempt from overtime, and I'll give you a few more seconds to answer this. And this is anonymous, so we won't know who's giving the right or wrong answers. All right, I think we've got a good selection here, and it looks like most of you are on top of this. The answer to the first question is the blue-collar worker, and that was C. And I'll go over each of these categories in just a few moments. All right. Okay, first regarding non-exempt hourly employees. They are entitled to minimum wage of not less than $7.25 an hour and overtime pay at a rate of not less than 1.5 times their regular rate of pay after 40 hours of work actually performed in a work week, and that work week is defined by the employer. Some city policies, county policies that we see also pay overtime on hours not actually worked, such as holidays and vacation time. This is not required by federal or state law, but is instead a policy decision that is made by the employer. In addition to the requirements to pay overtime for all hours actually worked over 40, Kentucky has what is known as the 7-day rule. And pursuant to KRS 337.050, an employee that works 7 days in any one work week must be paid at the rate of time and a half for all the time worked on the 7th day, unless that employee does not work more than 40 hours in the work week. And this can be very confusing, and it doesn't come up often, but it does come up. So I wanted to make sure that you all are aware of this. So let's look at an example. For this example, the employer's work week is Thursday to Wednesday, and the employee works 8 hours on Thursday. Friday, they work another 8 hours. Saturday, they come in and work 2 hours. Sunday, they also work an additional 2 hours. They come in on Monday, the 5th day, work 8 hours. On the 6th day, Tuesday, they work another 8 hours, which brings their total at this point at the end of 6 days to 36 hours. On day 7, the end of the work week, Wednesday, they work another 8 hours, which brings their total to 44 hours. So based on this statute, the employee should be paid overtime for 8 hours. So all the hours worked on Wednesday, which is the 7th day, and not just the 4 hours worked over 40. And if you have any questions about this, or if this ever comes up for you, feel free to give either myself or Courtney Straw a call or shoot us an email. Counties and cities can also provide compensatory time, also known as comp time, at 1.5 times the rate for any hours worked over 40. KRS 337.285 is a statute, and it specifically permits cities and their non-exempt city employees to agree on earning comp time in lieu of overtime. The statute requires that the employer has to have a policy in place. They have to have a written agreement with the employee. So both the employer and the employee have to agree to do this. If the employee doesn't want to do it, the employer cannot force them to do it. And if the employer doesn't want to provide it, the employee can't force the employer to provide it. In addition, the statute has a cap of 480 hours for emergency workers and a cap of 240 hours for all other employees. The employer can cap at less than these numbers, but they cannot go over. So for example, you may have a policy that caps all employees at 100 hours comp time, and anything over that cap has to be paid at time and a half after they reach 40 hours. You want to keep in mind that any unused comp time must be paid when a non-exempt employee leaves employment. So it can be very expensive when an employee leaves. So think about the number of hours that you want to have in place in your policies. Also, some cities have exempt comp time in place. So comp time for their exempt employees. Those are structured completely differently. So if that is something that you're interested in having, or you want to make sure that what you have in place now is okay, again, feel free to call us or shoot us an email with that information, and we'll be happy to help you. Exempt employees. For an employee to be exempt from overtime, they must generally satisfy what's called a duties test as well as a salary test. And they must receive a predetermined amount of pay each pay period. This pay cannot be subject to variations in pay based on quantity or quality of work. And they must receive a full salary for any week in which any work is performed. All right, so here is our next polling question, and this is one where you're going to need to respond in order to get credit for listening to the training. So I'm going to launch the second poll. And if you need credit for training, be sure to answer this poll. I will leave it up for a few minutes as I go on, but make sure that you answer that poll before we get to the next poll. All right, so now we're going to look at an overview of the final rule. Before we get into the requirements, I want to look at what has changed or what will be changing as of January 1st. The biggest change is to the annual salary threshold. For executive supervisory, administrative, professional, as well as outside sales exempt qualifications, the salary cap or the minimum that an employee can make to be exempt is currently $23,660 gross per year. This amount is increasing to $35,568 gross per year as of January 1st, 2020. So, what does that mean? It means for you that some currently exempt employees will be receiving overtime as of January 1st, 2020. Any employee making less than $35,568 gross per year or $684 gross per week must be paid overtime no matter what their duties are. So that's a really big part of this. Another change impacts what we call the highly compensated employees. These employees currently have a salary threshold of $100,000 gross per year, and this threshold as of January 1st, 2020 will be increasing to $107,432 per year. It is important to note that the Department of Labor did not make any changes to the duties test under the exempt categories. These categories include executive, supervisory, administrative, professional, which include learned and creative, computer, and highly compensated, as well as outside sales. So let's start by reviewing the requirements for an employee to be exempt under the executive supervisory exemption. The first requirement is a salary requirement. So as of January 1st, 2020, the employee has to make at least $35,568 gross per year. In addition to that salary threshold, the employee's primary duty must consist of management. So they have to handle things such as interviewing, training, setting hours, directing the work of employees, providing performance appraisals that are actually used in changes of work status, such as promotions, demotions, layoffs, transfers. They also have to handle employee complaints, they would handle disciplinary actions, and they would provide for safety of employees, and they would plan and control the budget for their department. So in addition to that salary threshold of $35,568, and in addition to the primary duty being management, they must also regularly supervise 2 or more full-time employees, and this includes full-time equivalents. So an example of that would be an employee who supervises 1 full-time employee and 2 part-time employees. That would be equivalent to 2 full-time employees. However, keep in mind that an employee that merely assists a manager of a particular department and supervises 2 or more employees only in that manager's absence does not meet the requirement. So they have to directly supervise that employee or 2 employees at least on a daily basis. So, in addition to the salary threshold requirements, the primary duty being management and supervising at least 2 employees, they have to also have the authority to hire or fire other employees, or the employee's suggestions and recommendations as to the hiring and firing, advancement, promotion, or any other change of status of other employees must be given particular weight. So what does particular weight mean? This would include making suggestions and recommendations that are part of the employee's job duties. So this would be something that is included in that employee's job description. Also, you have to look at the frequency in which the employee's suggestions and recommendations are relied upon by the employer. And this is okay even if the employee does not have final say in the decision for hiring and firing, which in the case of cities and counties, that would likely not be the case. Also, suggestions and recommendations have to pertain to the employees that the executive supervisory employee manages. It can't be related to occasional recommendations on the change in status of a coworker. So it has to be their direct reports. Next is the administrative exemption. Again, the employee must be compensated on a salary basis that is at least $684 gross per week as of January 1, 2020. In addition to that salary requirement, the employee's primary duty must consist of non-manual work directly related to the management or general business operations. Note that the phrase directly related to the management or general business operations refers to the type of work performed by the employee. So the employee has to perform work directly related to assisting with the running or servicing of the city, such as within a finance or within accounting, budgeting, auditing, purchasing, procurement, personnel management, human resources, employee benefits, public relations, internet and database administration, as well as legal and regulatory compliance. So for the administrative exemption, in addition to that salary threshold requirement, and in addition to their primary duty consisting of non-manual labor directly related to management, the primary duty must also require the exercise of discretion and independent judgment with respect to matters of significance. So as an employer, you need to ask yourself these questions. Does this employee have the authority to formulate, affect, interpret, or implement management policies or operating practices? Does the employee carry out major assignments in conducting the operations of the city? Do they perform work that affects city operations to a substantial degree? Do they have the authority to commit the city in matters that have significant financial impact? Does the employee have the authority to waive or deviate from established policies and procedures without prior approval? Do they provide consultation or expert advice to management? Do they have authority to negotiate and bind the city on significant matters? Are they involved in planning long-term or short-term goals? Do they investigate and resolve matters of significance on behalf of management? Or can they represent the city in handling a complaint or resolving grievances with employees? So some examples of what an employee with an administrative exemption may look like would be someone that has that's in the position of human resources manager. This is someone who's going to formulate, interpret, or implement employment policies. They're going to be involved in interviewing applicants. They're going to be involved in hiring, discipline, handling complaints, firing. All of those tasks would be within their job description. Another example would be a purchasing agent within the city or the county with authority to bind the city or county on significant purchases. This employee would meet the duties requirement for the administrative exemption, even if they must consult with top management officials when making a purchase commitment in excess of the budget. So next is the professional exemption. And under this category, we have two different categories. The first one that we're going to look at is a learned professional. And again, they must be compensated on a salary basis that is at least $684 gross per week as of January 1st, 2020. In addition to the salary requirements, the primary duty is the performance of work requiring knowledge of an advanced type, and they must have consistent exercise of discretion and judgment in a field of science or learning, and the advanced knowledge is acquired by a prolonged course of specialized instruction, intellectual instruction. And this is going to include the traditional professions of law, accounting, engineering, and other similar occupations. They're not going to include things like employees that have a skilled trade, or in some, even when the knowledge may be of an advanced type, but is not in a field of science or learning. So for cities and counties, we're probably talking about an employee who is an attorney for that organization, an accountant who's an employee of that organization, or an engineer would most likely fall into this category. The second category under the professional exemption is a creative professional. Again, we have the salary threshold of $35,568 gross per year. And in addition to that salary requirement, the employee's primary duty is the performance of work requiring invention, imagination, originality, or talent in a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. And the primary duty includes the consistent exercise of discretion and judgment. And these are usually in the fields of music, writing, acting, and the graphic arts. And there probably are not very many public agencies with an artist or musician on the payroll. The next exemption that we'll look at is another one where we probably don't have a lot of these employees on our payroll, but there may be a few out there. So it's the computer exemption. And again, they have to meet this salary basis that is at least $684 gross per week. And in addition to the salary requirement, the primary duty has to consist of the application of systems analysis techniques and procedures, including consulting with users to determine hardware, software, or system functional specifications, design, development, documentation, analysis, creation, testing, or modification of computer systems or programs, design, documentation, testing, creation, or modification of computer programs related to machine operations, or a combination of the aforementioned duties, the performance of which requires the same level of skills. So these are going to be employees that are employed as a computer systems analyst, computer programmer, software engineer, or other similarly skilled worker in the computer field. The last category we're going to look at is going to be that highly compensated employee. This employee, like I said, as of January 1st, 2020, has to make at least an annual compensation of $107,432 gross per year. In addition to that salary threshold, they must also customarily and regularly perform any one or more of the exempt duties or responsibilities of an executive, supervisory, administrative, professional. It could even include a computer employee. So this could include supervising 2 or more employees. So they meet that $107,000 threshold more than, and they customarily supervise more than 2 employees on a regular basis, on a daily basis. They maybe have the authority to hire and fire, or what they think about hiring and firing is given particular weight. So any one of those, any one that we've already talked about, could be included in this employee. And likely, if their compensation is that high, they're going to fit under an exempt category anyway. All right, so now we're going to go to poll number 3. This one is a true or false question. Part-time employees may be classified as exempt. So if you can, let me know if you think that a part-time employee can be classified as exempt. And we can even say that this employee supervises 4 part-time employees, and their recommendations for hiring and firing are given particular weight. So do you think that an employee could be exempt if they are part-time? All right, I'm going to end the polling. And the answer to this is actually true. As long as this employee meets the salary threshold, so they're at the salary threshold, and they meet the duties test for one of the exemptions, they could, as a part-time employee, be exempt. Likely, again, in a public agency, we're not going to have part-time employees that are going to meet that salary threshold. So in most cases, our part-time employees are going to be non-exempt or hourly. All right, important to note is that the exemptions do not apply to, and this is very important for cities and counties and other public agencies to be aware of, blue-collar workers who perform work involving repetitive operations with their hands, physical skill, and energy. So we could be talking about a public works employee, streets and roads employee, any type of blue-collar worker who performs manual labor. Also, it does not apply to non-management employees in maintenance, construction, and similar occupations, such as, again, public works, streets and roads, mechanics. They are not exempt no matter how highly paid they might be. In addition, these exemptions do not apply to police officers, detectives, firefighters, paramedics, rescue workers, and other similar employees, regardless of rank and pay, who perform work such as preventing, controlling, or extinguishing fires of any type, rescuing fire, crime or accident victims, preventing or detecting crimes, conducting investigations or inspections for violations of law, performing surveillance, pursuing, restraining, and apprehending suspects, detaining or supervising suspected and convicted criminals and interviewing witnesses, interrogating and fingerprinting suspects, and preparing investigative reports. These employees do not qualify as exempt as executive or supervisory, so under that executive supervisory exemption, because their primary duty is not management. Also, they don't qualify as exempt under administrative because their primary duty is not the performance of work directly related to the management or general operations. These employees also do not qualify as exempt professionals because their primary duty is not the performance of work requiring knowledge of an advanced type in a field of science or learning customarily acquired by a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction, or the performance of work requiring invention, imagination, originality, or talent in a recognized field of artistic or creative endeavor. And even though some police officers, firefighters, paramedics, EMTs, and other similar employees may have college degrees, a specialized academic degree is not a standard prerequisite for employment in these occupations. So for example, if a city has a police chief and that chief is the only officer in the city, the chief would never qualify as exempt because they would be out there patrolling the streets, going through accidents, doing investigations, interviewing witnesses, doing reports. So they would have to be out there. The majority of their job would not be administrative in nature. All right, we've got another poll here. Whoops. All right, as you can see, this is my first time with this software, so I'm on the struggle bus today. All right, so let's look at polling question number 4. And this question is, the Public Works Director, who has a water operator's license, is the only employee in the Public Works Department and does 90% manual labor. Does the Public Works Director fit into any of the following exceptions? So would this Public Works Director fit into the executive supervisory, administrative, professional, or none of the above, and the employee is exempt? So again, this Public Works Director, we don't know, he has no employees working under him. He does have a water operator's license, and he does 90% manual labor. Which category do you think this employee would fit under? So let's share these results. It looks like most of you got this correct. This employee would not qualify as exempt since they are considered a manual laborer or a blue-collar worker, and their primary duty is not management, and they don't supervise any employees. And a water operator's license is not considered a prolonged course of specialized intellectual instruction. So in this case, the employee would be considered non-exempt and would have to be paid overtime. All right, our next polling question, number 5. This question is, the city administrator supervises 50 employees, 50 city employees. They interview and recommend new hires to the mayor. They handle employee complaints. They discipline employees and approve employee schedules set by the department directors. So do they fit into any of the following exceptions or exemptions? So could they fall under executive or supervisory? Would they fall under administrative? Could they fall under professional, or do they not fall under any, and are they non-exempt? Okay. All right, looks like most of you all got this right. So the city administrator in this case would qualify under the executive exemption as they supervise more than 2 employees, and their primary duties consist of management because they handle interviews, employee complaints, and discipline. And just for the sake of the question, we're going to say that they make $700 gross per week. So they also meet the salary threshold and would fit under the executive supervisory exemption. All right, got another polling question for you. This one is number 6. And this is a city financial officer. This person is a certified public accountant. They audit city accounts. They approve expenditures up to $5,000 as long as they're contained in the city budget. And they supervise only the city treasurer. So does the CFO fit into any of the following exceptions? And just for the sake of this example, we're going to say that the city financial officer has a gross weekly salary of $690 per week. So do they fall under executive supervisory, administrative, professional, or are they hourly? All right, share these results. And again, most of you got it right. So it sounds like you must be listening. All right. So what are some of the potential challenges that we're going to face with this change? You want to remember that exempt employees are going to be hourly if they make less than $684 gross per week. Again, that's as of January 1, 2020. So you may have an increase in budget costs. Also with this change, there could be morale issues if you end up changing an employee's status from exempt to non-exempt. And there also could be violations of wage and hour laws if you don't train your employees on what is compensable time, and if you don't train your supervisors on the importance of making sure employees track all of their hours worked. So how can you avoid pitfalls? Remember that salaried employees are not always exempt, and supervisors are not necessarily exempt. We have to remember that the primary duties have to be management, and they have to supervise 2 or more employees, or if their job consists of mostly manual labor. So if it's mostly manual labor, even if they're a supervisor, they may not fit under an exemption. Also keep in mind that you need to display the minimum wage poster, and there's a link here that you'll get in the materials that will take you to an article that will bring you to all of the posters, all the current posters that should be hanging in a conspicuous location. If you have not changed any of your posters in the last couple of years, likely the majority of your posters are out of date. So look at all of these. I think I've included the date when they were updated so that you'll have that as well. Also, make sure you maintain detailed records of hours worked for non-exempt or hourly employees and all wages paid to those employees. However, don't keep records of hours worked for truly exempt employees unless you have a valid reason for doing so. And I'm going to give you some valid reasons that you may use for tracking an exempt employee's time as we go through this. Also, make sure and retain payroll records for at least 4 years as required by the Kentucky Department of Libraries and Archives, and review the FLSA exemption test questionnaire, which you will receive upon conclusion of the webinar. Now let's go over 6 steps to prepare. Step number 1, you want to identify the employees that need to be reclassified as non-exempt. So those current employees that you have that are exempt that make less than $684 gross per week. Those are the employees that we're going to pull out. We're going to make a list of those employees. We're going to estimate how much overtime these employees currently work. So this would be a valid reason for tracking the time of an exempt employee. You could do this for a month or a remainder of the year just to get an idea of how many hours over 40 they work each week. And then, of course, analyze your budget to see where that puts you. Step number 2 is going to be to develop a compensation plan for reclassified employees. You want to compare the cost of giving raises to bring them up to that exempt threshold against the cost of giving them overtime. Are they already really close to that threshold? If so, it may be easier just to bump them up to the threshold. What is the most cost-effective way for you to handle this? Is the cost of overtime going to be much greater than raising their wages up to the threshold? And if so, we might want to go ahead and just raise them up and keep them as exempt employees. Also, step number 2, employers can pay out an hourly rate based on current salary and limit overtime, or My least favorite is figure the amount of possible overtime and reduce the employee's salary so that the total amount stays the same with overtime. So an example of this would be a current employee makes $34,000 a year. So they don't meet that threshold come January 1. So if, as an employer, I know they will accrue about $12,000 in overtime costs a year, I can reduce their base salary to about $23,000, and then that added with the overtime costs that they're going to get will bring them to $35,000, which is actually $1,000 more than what they currently make. I just really think the morale of doing that, of lowering someone's pay, even though they're really going to make more, can be really difficult for an employee to handle. So that's probably my least favorite. Also, you can look at redistribution of jobs to limit overtime. Do we have some employees who are doing a lot of work? Maybe my exempt employees are working a lot of overtime, where my non-exempt employees sometimes are sitting around with nothing to do. So can I shift some of those job duties? You can also, like I talked about in the very beginning, consider compensatory time. So they can take time off instead of being paid overtime. But again, remember that if the employee leaves, whatever time they haven't used, they have to be paid for. And likely it's going to be at the rate they're making at the time they leave. So that can be expensive for a public agency. So now let's look at all these options in a little more detail. So the first one, increase the salary to the minimum level required to retain an employee's exempt status. So we're going to increase their salary to $684 gross per week. So a risk that we may have to deal with is that it could create salary compression and result in higher than expected costs, as compensation must be realigned up the ladder. So if I give one employee a raise, it may bring them too close to their supervisor, may bring them above their supervisor. So therefore, I might have to raise that supervisor's salary up as well. So you may have to do some realigning to keep things fair and equal. So that could actually cost you more money down the road. Some opportunities include, it could improve morale by giving additional compensation because I'm getting a raise, and the retention of that exempt status, which a lot of employees do like. Also, it saves employer time by eliminating the need to track, record, and report hours worked. So if I allow those employees to stay at that lower salary, they're now going to have to start tracking, recording, and reporting all hours worked. The second one, again, leave base pay the same and pay overtime for hours worked over 40. So we're going to make this employee a non-exempt employee because they don't meet the salary threshold. So some issues with this include an increased cost in overtime. It also could create liability for the employer if the employee fails to track, record, and report all hours worked. And probably because the employee isn't used to doing it, they're used to just staying late and getting the work done, coming in on the weekend, whatever it takes to get it done. So they're not used to tracking time. It's something new they're going to have to learn. And also it could damage morale, as previously exempt positions may carry less flexibility, and sometimes exempt status is seen as a higher status than non-exempt. Some opportunities include improve morale by giving time and a half for hours worked over 40. And so making it clear to your employees that now you're going to get paid for any hours worked over 40. And you're going to promote the concept that all employees are paid when required to spend time away from work, family, and other non-working pursuits. The next one, reduce or eliminate overtime hours and hire extra workers as needed. This is going to require training for newly non-exempt workers and possibly their supervisors, because again, they have to learn how to track time, what is compensable time, what's expected of them, when can they work overtime. There's a lot of things that they're going to have to learn. And it could damage morale, as previously exempt positions may carry less flexibility, like I said in the last one. And it could damage morale, or it could create liability if the employer bans overtime hours, but the employee works them anyway, because that does happen. Some opportunities could be that it creates opportunity to reclassify jobs and retool job descriptions and responsibilities. Again, going back to that idea of, do I have some employees that maybe aren't doing as much, that I could take some job duties off this employee and spread it around? It also offers a chance to be more creative and resourceful in how things get done. and it minimizes employer costs so part-time help can be added. The last is restructuring, or actually this isn't the last, but decreasing the pay allocated to base salary, at least minimum wage, and adding compensation to account for overtime that will be worked. That's the example I gave you earlier, where we would reduce the employee's $34,000 exempt salary to $23,000 and account for how much overtime they're going to receive so that they're at least making what they're making now. Again, some risk for that is it could create liability if the employee or employer fails to track, record, and report hours worked. And it could damage morale, as again, that previously exempt position may carry less flexibility, and decrease in base salary could be perceived negatively. Also, some opportunities may be that it holds employer costs constant. So we know what that employee is going to make, and it minimizes employer costs. So maybe that we can hire part-time help. Next is restructuring the workforce, transferring duties from newly non-exempt workers to those who have had their salaries increased to remain exempt. And we've talked a little bit about this in some of the other examples. Some risks include it could prompt employee concerns about equity and fairness. It also could require training for will require training for newly non-exempt employees and their supervisors. And it creates, as opportunities, it can create opportunity to reclassify jobs and retool job descriptions, as we talked about in some of the others, and also offering a chance to be more creative and resourceful in how things get done. All right, so step number 3. This is a step that you're going to review wage and hour policies and processes. So you want to review your timekeeping processes to see if any changes need to be made before January 1st. And this is usually going to be in regard to an employee's status change. So if they were exempt, now they're non-exempt, we have to make sure that our timekeeping processes are up to date so that we're tracking all of the hours worked for those newly non-exempt employees. Also, make sure you have a mobile device use policy and an email policy, a rest and meal period policy, possibly even a time travel policy, and an unauthorized overtime policy. For the unauthorized overtime policy, you want to make sure that your employees are asking before they work overtime. This is going to keep you from paying out overtime when it's not expected, which can then affect the budget. So you want to make sure that all of these policies are in place. Step number 4, communicate the changes. This is extremely important. You want to develop a strategy for communicating the changes. You're going to decide who will deliver the information. And I think it's best to have one person deliver the changes, deliver this information, so that it remains a consistent message. However, make sure that the employee supervisors are included in these discussions so that they are clear on the change. Also, you want to decide when will it be delivered. It needs to be done before the end of the year. You definitely want to let an employee know that this may be happening before the end of the year. And format of delivery. I think in all cases, these messages should be delivered to the employee in person. Also, in step number 4, we have to remember that many employees that will now have to punch a time clock are going to be upset about this fact. They may feel that they're losing prestige. Some may even view it as a demotion. Let them know that this is only a category of pay and not a reflection of their importance or level of contribution. Make sure they understand this is a change in federal law that is impacting our budget and that you're trying to make changes that will be the least detrimental to the city or the county or your agency and to the employees as well as the budget. But expect that they're going to view this negatively. Again, communicate this well before the deadline of 1/1/20. And one way to soften the blow is to let them know that they're now going to be paid for all hours worked over 40. So anything that they normally would have done over 40 hours that they didn't get paid for before, they will now get paid for. Some employees may also feel like they're not going to have enough time to get their work done because, again, they're used to being able to come in whenever they need to get the work done. Just let them know that adjustments can be made if they have to stay late to get something done, or you can assign others to help them. And again, have that policy in place that addresses overtime if they have to request permission before working. And one thing you also want to remember that is if they don't request permission, even with a policy in place that says they have to have it, they still have to be paid for that time. But if your policy is clear and has been explained to them, they can be disciplined for not following the policy. Number 5, review job descriptions. So why do accurate job descriptions matter? Well, there's many reasons. But when they accurately describe or reflect the expected day-to-day responsibilities, scope of position, and educational requirements, they show the critical components of how to classify the jobs correctly. So if I have an employee that I am classifying as exempt because they fit under the executive exemption, in their job description, it's going to say that they supervise 2 employees, and they're going to say what positions those employees hold. They supervise 5 employees, whatever it is, but you're going to list out the positions that they hold. You're going to say in there their primary duty is one of management, that they're involved in the interviewing process. They handle disciplining issues. They make recommendations to the mayor, the commission, the city manager, however you're organized. Just make sure your job descriptions make it clear that that employee is truly exempt. So again, use terms from the regulations to describe the employee's duties. So again, for human resources managers, we might say something like, duties include creation and implementation of personnel policies, handling employee complaints, etc. Now, in regard to job descriptions, make sure you have accurate job titles. Accurate job titles reflect the position and not infer educational or professional expertise required to perform the job. Job titles do not establish whether a particular exemption applies, whether the employee is exempt. Exempt status has to be determined on the basis of whether the employee's compensation, so they meet that salary test, and they also meet the duties test of one of the exemptions. So just because we title a custodial position as maintenance engineer does not make that employee exempt. Also, job descriptions should clearly identify an employee's primary and essential duties. They should be reviewed periodically to determine whether the job duties originally described continue to be accurate. I like to see them reviewed on an annual, no more than a biannual basis. And regular audits of the duties actually performed by employees should help to determine whether the employees continue to meet the requirements for exempt status, or if we have to put them in a non-exempt hourly position. If you need a job description audit checklist or other helpful materials for updating your job descriptions, you can call or email me or Courtney Straw, and we'll be happy to get you that information. Step number 6, the final step. You want to make sure you train your reclassified employees and their supervisors. Employees that have never been non-exempt or never been hourly before, or supervisors that have never had to manage hourly employees, have to be trained about such issues such as what constitutes compensable time. What is the city's policy regarding overtime? Who do they have to request that time from? And what constitutes a complaint that could trigger a retaliation claim? And let your supervisors know that they actually can have personal liability if they require an employee to work off the clock without being compensated. Also, make sure they understand that they cannot be working on city-provided mobile devices, phones, laptops, etc., after hours unless they are compensated. Many employees are used to responding to managers after hours. So, supervisors need to be aware of after-hours mobile device policies. And if you don't have a policy, let us know and we'll be happy to help you with that. They have to consider how badly they need that information if the city will have to pay the non-exempt employee for any overtime, And in many cases, supervisors may just have to adjust their expectations. Another policy that is really important for you to have is what we call a work performed by non-exempt employees outside of normal working hours. And this is one where it makes it clear to the employee what should be compensated for the non-exempt employee. And again, if you need examples of any of these, you need us to review your personnel policies, just let us know. All right, we've got another poll for you. And this is another one of those, are you listening? And this is to get your training credit. So if you can answer this question that we have up here, what is 5 plus 3? And I'm going to leave that, I guess, there for a few seconds to make sure everyone is able to get credit that they need. Looks like we got pretty good results so far. I'll leave it up there just a few more minutes. So, one of the last items I want to mention are penalties. And you can see the statistic up here, 80% of wage and hour complaints filed result in a violation. So penalties include payment of federal income tax that should have been withheld from the employee, that should have been classified as non-exempt, payment of Medicare contributions that should have been withheld, and interest on taxes that should have been withheld. Also, a penalty for failure to properly file tax returns and pay taxes, and a more substantial penalty if the IRS determines there was negligent, intentional, or fraudulent behavior. And this is why I like to see a checklist prepared by the agency, by the employer, for all exempt employees that showed that you made the effort to classify the employee correctly. So again, you'll be getting that in your materials either today or tomorrow as soon as we have the recording together. Also, criminal sanctions, including imprisonment and fines up to $100,000. And back in the fall, I had looked up the year-to-date penalties for the Federal Department of Labor. And at that point, they were up to $2,673,000 that employers had to pay. And this was any type of wage and hour violation, excluding child labor law violations. So that's a pretty big number and definitely should be eye-opening. In addition, it looks like too on their website, they had collected $322 million in back wages as of October 2019. So again, they're out there, they're actually doing audits, so be aware and make sure your employees are classified correctly. Also, penalties can be assessed for retaliation claims. So if you have an employee that makes a complaint that they think they're not classified correctly, or if they say that they've been asked to work overtime and not be clocked in for that time or not put those hours down, you want to be very careful that that employee is not retaliated against by their supervisor, by any other employee in the organization. And we want to also make sure that any employee who is a witness or is somehow involved in the legal proceeding, that they are not retaliated against as well, because the retaliation claims can be even more expensive. So be very aware, make sure your supervisors are aware if this ever does occur. And lastly, I want you to remember 2016, and I'm sure lots of you remember 2016. Be aware of the possibility that there could be challenges to the final rule. In 2016, for those of you who aren't aware, this rule was also increased, and the weekly wage at that time, the requirement was increased to $913 gross per week, which is significantly more than the current $684 gross per week. And it also included automatic increases in the wage threshold, so it was going to automatically increase throughout the years. That rule was put on hold about 1 week before it was to be implemented. And at that point, many employers, I know many of the organizations that I had worked with already had raised salaries up to that $913 gross per week threshold so that they could keep those employees exempt. So that was something they had to pay out that they ended up, they really didn't have to at that point. So as you can imagine, and then again in the filing in August 2017, this rule that $913 gross per week and the automatic increases was actually invalidated. So this current rule has been vetted a little more closely, a little more thoroughly. And again, this wage increase is not as high as that 913. It's significantly lower. So there probably aren't going to be too many challenges with this. So this, because this threshold is significantly lower, and also there are no automatic increases. And this month, I was lucky enough to be able to go to an employment law conference, and I attended a session with the Department of Labor solicitor and the head of Wage and Hour. And they both said they expected challenges, but did not think this rule, but they did think that this rule was still going to affect on January 1, 2020. And I agree, I think that it will go into effect. So I want everyone to be prepared, but do not make changes until January 1, 2020. And make it clear to your employees that if you're going to have to make changes, it will not occur until January 1, 2020. And if for some reason this law doesn't go into effect, that those changes will be placed on hold. Also know that if anything such as what happened in 2016 happens again, we at KLC will make sure that you're notified through social media, through our KLC email direct line, as well as our KLC HR blog, which is on our website at www.klc.org. And with that being said, don't delay in a self-audit. Just be prepared. Make sure you're ready to move forward with this on January 1st. All right. And I have one last question for you. And it is, as long as an employee is paid the minimum salary required, $684 gross per week as of January 1, 2020, the duties the employee performs do not matter in determining exempt status. So is that true or false? You can let me know. I'll give you a few more seconds to respond to that. Is it true or false? The employee meets the salary threshold, and if they meet that salary threshold, the duties that they perform don't matter. So they could be a manual laborer, they could have no employees. Okay, so we're going to end polling on that one. And as most of you correctly, the answer to that is false. As an exempt employee must pass both the salary test, the 684 gross per week as of January 1st, and they must meet at least one of the exemptions, which would be your executive, your administrative, or your professional. Okay, and with that, if I can find the questions tab, I'm going to see if we have any questions. I think I got it. All right. Okay, so one of the questions that we received are you saying it's improper to require exempt workers, including senior level managers, to clock in and out on a mobile time clock system? As long as they're not tracking, as long as you're not basing their pay on that, it's perfectly fine. It's something that we do here. I clock in when I get here just to let our receptionists know that we're here, and then I'll clock out when I leave. I don't clock in and out for lunch. If I forget to clock out and I stay clocked in all night, it's perfectly fine because my salary is not based on the fact that I'm clocking in and clocking out. Okay? Also, let's see. If a police chief has multiple employees and rarely works in the field, is he or she considered exempt? Well, we can't give advice on this specifically on that specific question. That's something that you have to work with your city attorney, with others involved. Like I said, I will send out either today or tomorrow FLSA exemption checklist that should help you make that determination. In most cases, police chiefs, fire chiefs are not going to be exempt because they do spend a lot of time out in the field. But if yours is truly administrative, they're behind the desk most of the day, they're not working out in the field, it is possible that they could be exempt from overtime. Okay, let's see. Another question we have, if an employee has a company cell phone and answers it after hours, they will need to be paid overtime. If they're an hourly employee and they work more than a de minimis amount of time, that's usually around 10 minutes. So if they're on the phone for 10 minutes or more answering emails or talking to someone in the city or a citizen or something like that, something that is work related and it's 10 minutes or more, yes, they would have to account for that time, but that's only if they're a non-exempt hourly employee. So hopefully that answers your question there. I also have another question. It says, we have a step and grade for our pay system. We have employees who may be at a step higher than the threshold, which means they make more than what the position cutoff is. But if we were to bring a new person in this position, they would be at entry level, which would not meet the threshold. In this case, we would need to look at the position also as not meeting the threshold needs. Okay, so if what you're saying is that you brought in a new person and they weren't at that requirement, the January 1st requirement, but they meet all of the other exemption requirements, but they don't meet the salary requirements, then yes, they would have to be non-exempt at that point. Another question is, what do you do with employees who are part-time exempt by law, our office? Do the part-time employees need to meet that $35,000 gross per week standard also? And the answer to that is yes. It doesn't matter if they're part-time, full-time. If they meet the duties test, they still have to meet that threshold, that gross threshold per week. So you want to make sure that they are meeting that threshold. Okay, let's see. Another question we have is, if an employee does not directly supervise two employees, does that automatically disqualify them from being exempt? If so, what is the definition of supervising an employee? Well, they could still be exempt under the administrative exemption. That does not require supervision of any employees, but we're going to have to look at the requirements of their job and see if do they meet under the administrative exemption. And hopefully when you get this checklist, that's going to help you make a decision on this. And if you have questions once you get it specifically, I'm happy to try and help you. But again, we can't give legal advice, so that's something that would have to come from your city attorney or county attorney. All right, another question we have is, if we were to review pay to meet the salary requirements, what would we base ourselves on? If we were to review pay to meet the salary requirements, what would we base ourselves on? We're a small town, $2,000 population. Well, the salary threshold is not going to change even if, no matter what size city you are. So you still have to meet that $35,568 gross per year in order to be exempt. It doesn't matter the size of your community at all. Okay, we've got another question here. Does non-exempt employees, if based on a 40-hour work week, have to work a full 40 hours to receive their full weekly pay? So we're talking about non-exempt employees. No, they would not. They would be paid if they're non-exempt, so they're hourly employees. They would be paid based on actual hours worked. So if they only worked 38 hours in a work week, they should be clocking in, clocking out, somehow tracking their time. But if they only work 38 hours per week, they would only be paid 38 hours a week. Now, if we're talking about an exempt employee, you know, if they take off, if our policy is that if you are absent for 4 hours, you have to turn in 4 hours of vacation leave or sick leave or something like that, the employee would have to, as an exempt employee, they would still have to turn in time for that based on your policy. So a lot of this is going to depend, especially for exempt employees, on what your policy says. Now, If we have an exempt employee and we have some really bad weather this winter, which I'm hoping we don't, and our city or county offices are closed, and we make the determination to close them, and that employee cannot come in or does not come in because we've closed City Hall, we have to still pay that employee. Even if our policy says they have to use vacation time, if they're out of vacation time because they were ready, willing, and able to work, and we told them to stay home, if they didn't have vacation time to submit to cover those hours, we would still have to pay them for that time. So again, when questions come up with that, let us know specifically about especially inclement weather, and try to have a written policy in place and make sure that you go over these written policies with your employees periodically throughout the year. So again, if we have an inclement weather policy, before inclement weather hits, I'm going to send that out to all of my employees and let them know what that policy is. Okay, well, we are at 3:05, and at this point, I don't have any other questions. So I'm going to end the webinar. And again, you'll be getting a copy of the webinar, the recording of the webinar, as well as all of the materials and some attachments to the materials that may help you. It should be sometime today. So if you have any questions when you get that, or any questions as you're implementing this process, feel free to either give Courtney or myself a call or an email. Thank you.